The championship trophy sat forgotten on the grass, its little gold batter frozen mid-swing in the fading orange light, because nobody on the Lakeview Hawks was looking at it anymore. Ryan Mitchell stood behind the third base fence with his cap pulled low, clapping until his palms stung, watching his daughter Emma pile onto Ava Brooks in a screaming, dust-covered heap of 10-year-olds who had just won a game nobody expected them to win. He was still clapping when he felt someone stop a few feet away from him, close enough that he noticed the shadow before he noticed the person. He turned, and a woman was standing there in a plain gray cardigan, her arms crossed loosely over her chest, watching him instead of the celebration. Her hair had come loose from its ponytail during 9 innings of nervous pacing along that same fence line, and there was something in the set of her jaw, something patient and searching, that made the noise of the field fall away for a second. She studied his face the way you'd study an old photograph you weren't sure was really yours. Then she said it, quietly, almost gently, like she'd been rehearsing the words for a month and still wasn't sure she wanted to say them out loud. "You don't remember me, do you?" It wasn't a question so much as a fact she was laying down between them, and Ryan felt the trophy, the scoreboard, the whole roaring field tilt sideways for just a moment, because something about her voice had reached backward through 22 years and touched a version of himself he hadn't thought about in a long, long time. To find out who she really was to him and what her question would cost them both to answer, stay until the very end of this story. If you have ever stood at a fence like that one, cheering for a child while quietly wondering whatever happened to the person you used to be before life filled in around you, you already know there is a particular ache in that kind of moment. And if these overlooked ordinary hero stories speak to something in you, we would love to hear it in the comments, because so many of you watching have lived some version of this yourselves. There is an old argument that never quite settles, the one about whether a person should have spoken up years ago instead of staying quiet and letting time do what it wanted with 2 lives that used to be tangled together, and we will let this story make its own case as it goes. 22 years ago, none of this existed. Not the fence, not the trophy, not the 2 children who would someday need each other the way their parents once had. 22 years ago, there was only a narrow street in a town called Millbrook, 2 houses with a low chain-link fence between their backyards, and 2 11-year-olds who had worn a path through the grass so deep their mothers used to joke about needing to reseed it every spring. Ryan Mitchell had been a quiet kid even then, the kind who noticed which neighbor's dog needed water and which teacher was having a hard week, and Abigail had been the one who dragged him out of his own head, who decided one August afternoon that he was her best friend, whether he'd agreed to it or not. They had built a fort out of her father's old lumber. They had a code language made of bird whistles. They had promised, the way children promise things they cannot possibly keep, that they would know each other forever. Then, on a Tuesday in October with no warning that either of them remembered clearly afterward, a moving truck backed into Abigail's driveway, and by that Friday the house was empty, and the family was gone, transferred across the country for her father's job, before an 11-year-old boy had even worked up the nerve to say the things he'd been too shy to say all summer. He remembered standing at the fence for a week afterward, waiting for a truck that never came back. Nobody had given him an address. He had written her name in a notebook so many times the graphite wore a shine into the page. And then, the way childhood does, the notebook got lost. The house got sold years later when his parents downsized, and Abigail Brooks became something he thought about only in the specific aching quiet of certain October evenings, a name attached to a feeling he never fully let himself examine. Now Ryan Mitchell was 33 years old, a maintenance technician for the Lakeview Unified School District, and a widower raising a 9-year-old daughter mostly on his own, since a car accident had taken his wife Claire 2 years earlier on a rain-slick highway that he still couldn't drive past without his hands tightening on the wheel. He kept to himself at work. He fixed boilers and replaced fluorescent ballasts and knew every squeaking hinge in 3 elementary schools by sound alone, and if you had asked anyone at the district office to describe him, they would have said quiet, reliable, keeps his head down, good with his hands. Almost none of them knew that he had once, in another life entirely, been an assistant coach for a semi-pro summer league that he had a batting eye sharp enough that a scout had called his father's house twice before Ryan's own father, overwhelmed and grieving his wife's early death, quietly let the opportunity pass because the family needed him working, not chasing something as uncertain as baseball. Ryan had never resented that decision out loud. He had simply folded the dream up small enough to carry in his back pocket, and never mentioned it again, not even to Claire, not really. Not in the way that would have made her understand what it cost him to watch other men's sons get drafted on the sports channel, while he tightened bolts on a cafeteria dishwasher. When Emma's softball coach, a harried volunteer dad named Pete Ruiz, quit 3 games into the season after a work transfer to Ohio, the Lakeview Hawks were staring down a summer with no coach and a growing chance the league would simply fold the team. Ryan hadn't planned to raise his hand. He had stood in the back of that emergency parents' meeting in the elementary school gymnasium with his arms crossed, telling himself he was there only to hear what would happen to Emma's Tuesday and Thursday evenings. And then he had watched the silence stretch out across 30 parents, who all suddenly found their phones very interesting. And something in him, some old muscle memory of showing up for people who needed showing up for, made his hand go up before his brain had fully signed off on the decision. Emma had looked at him from her folding chair like he'd just announced he could fly. That was how, on a bright humid evening in early June, Ryan Mitchell found himself standing at home plate on the Lakeview community fields, with a clipboard he didn't really need, and a duffel bag of borrowed equipment, facing down 12 girls between the ages of 9 and 10, who were sizing him up with the particular unsentimental honesty that children reserve for new adults in charge of them. He introduced himself. He told them he wasn't going to yell, that he expected them to hustle and to be kind to each other, and that the person who worked the hardest at practice would start. No exceptions, no favorites, not even for his own daughter. Emma beamed at that. A few of the other girls exchanged skeptical looks, the kind that said we will see about that. And then there was Ava Brooks. She was standing near the back of the group in cleats that were a size too big, borrowed from an older cousin, her glove tucked under one arm, like she was afraid someone might take it from her. And when Ryan called out the first drill, a simple fielding rotation at short, she was the only kid on the field who was already jogging into position before he'd finished the sentence. She fielded a routine grounder cleanly, planted her feet, and threw a strike to first that had real snap on it. The kind of throw that made the parent working first base flinch and then grin. Ryan made a small note on his clipboard without quite realizing he was doing it. Good instincts, he wrote, coachable, hungry. Over that first week he noticed the mother before he consciously registered noticing her. The way you notice a low hum in a room before you identify its source. She came to every single practice, arriving early enough to claim the same spot along the third base fence, a folding chair she never actually unfolded, and she watched with an intensity that seemed almost too focused for a Tuesday evening rec league, her eyes tracking her daughter around the field with something that looked less like casual pride and more like vigilance, like she was cataloging every small victory to hand her daughter later, at home, in private. She never called out corrections during drills. She never hovered by the dugout the way some of the other parents did. She simply watched, arms folded, quiet, and when practice ended, she collected Ava without fanfare, and the two of them walked to a modest sedan in the corner of the lot and drove off before Ryan had usually finished packing the equipment bag. He didn't think much of it at first, beyond a vague, unexamined sense that something about the woman's stillness felt familiar in a way he couldn't place, the same way a smell can pull at a memory before the memory itself surfaces. He was too busy that first week, sorting out batting orders and bus schedules, and trying to remember which of the 12 girls answered to which nickname, too busy being a single father managing a full-time maintenance job and an unpaid coaching position, and a grieving 9-year-old who still sometimes crawled into his bed at 2 a.m, asking questions about her mother that he didn't have good answers for. What Ryan did not know yet, standing on that field calling out fielding drills to a dozen girls in matching Hawks jerseys, was that 30 feet away, behind a pair of sunglasses she wore even on overcast evenings, Abigail Brooks was doing everything in her power not to say his name out loud, because she had recognized him the very first practice, Instantly, completely, the way you recognize your own handwriting. And she had spent every evening since trying to decide whether telling him the truth would be a gift to both of their daughters or a wound she had no right to reopen after 22 years of silence. That had never, not once, been fully her choice to keep. 11 months earlier, a version of this story with an entirely different ending had already begun to take shape in a hospital waiting room 3 states away. Though neither of them knew it yet, and it would take almost that whole 11 months, plus one long, aching summer of Tuesday and Thursday practices, before either parent found the courage to say what needed saying. The second week of the season brought the first real test, and it did not go the way Ryan had hoped. The Hawks were scheduled to play the Riverside Comets, a team stacked with girls who'd been in a competitive travel league since they were 7, and Ryan watched his rec league roster get outmatched in almost every measurable way within the first 2 innings. What became clear very quickly, though, was that Ava Brooks was not overmatched at all. She went 2 for 2 at the plate with a double that nearly cleared the fence in left, and in the bottom of the third, she made a diving stop at shortstop that had both dugouts on their feet, coming up throwing in one motion to nail the runner at first by a full step. It was, without exaggeration, the best defensive play Ryan had seen from a 9-year-old in his life, and he told her so, crouching down to her eye level after the play. And for just a second, something in her face cracked open, some hunger to be told she'd done something right by an adult who meant it. That was when the trouble started, quietly, the way real trouble usually does. Ava's father, a man named Dale Brooks, who Ryan had never once seen at a practice, showed up unannounced at the 4th game, arriving in the 5th inning smelling faintly of something Ryan didn't want to name, and loudly critiquing his daughter's every at-bat from the bleachers, telling her to stop babying her swing, telling her she was better than half the coaches out here anyway, telling anyone within earshot that this rec league was a waste of a kid with real talent. Ryan watched Ava's shoulders climb toward her ears with every shouted correction, watched the confident, instinctive ball player from 2 innings earlier disappear into a stiff, flinching kid swinging at pitches she should have taken. When she struck out looking on a pitch a foot outside, her father's voice cracked across the field, sharp and public, and Ryan saw Abigail go rigid at the fence, her hands gripping the chain link so hard her knuckles went white, though she said nothing, did nothing, simply stood there absorbing it, the way Ryan would later understand. She had absorbed a great many things over the years, without ever once raising her own voice in return. After the game, in the parking lot, Ryan made a decision he would replay in his head for weeks afterward. He approached Dale Brooks directly, calmly, the way he approached a broken boiler, methodically and without heat, and told him that if he wanted to keep coming to games, he needed to let the coaching happen on the field and not from the bleachers, that Ava was doing everything right, and didn't need to hear otherwise in front of her whole team. It was by any reasonable measure a mild and professional thing to say. Dale did not take it that way. He said some things about volunteer coaches who thought they knew more than they did, about people who fix toilets for a living lecturing him about his own daughter, and the exchange ended with Dale stalking off, and with Abigail catching Ryan's eye for one long unreadable second before she quietly loaded her daughter into the sedan and drove away. There's a debate that comes up in every dugout, every sideline, every kitchen table, where a parent has ever watched a coach correct their child. Whether the people who show up consistently, without credentials, without pay, purely because a team needed someone, deserve the same authority as the ones with the titles and the travel league resumes, or whether a volunteer with a wrench in his back pocket has any business telling a paying, present parent how to raise his own kid. Ryan never once claimed the authority out loud. He simply kept showing up, kept noticing what the paid experts hadn't bothered to notice, and let the results speak for themselves, inning after inning, week after week. The breaking point came 2 weeks later, at the district's mid-season evaluation meeting, a formality Ryan hadn't taken seriously until Dale Brooks showed up to it with a complaint already typed and printed, alleging that Coach Mitchell had been inappropriately confrontational with a parent, had shown favoritism toward his own daughter in the batting order, and was, in Dale's words, not fit to be entrusted with other people's children, given that he had, quote, no actual credentials beyond fixing things around a school building, It didn't matter that the batting order had Ava hitting cleanup over Emma. It didn't matter that 3 other parents spoke up in Ryan's defense. The league coordinator, wary of any complaint that used the word inappropriate and terrified of liability, told Ryan quietly after the meeting that it might be best, just for the rest of the season, if he stepped back from the head coaching role and let an assistant take over the remaining games, and that they'd revisit things for next year. Ryan didn't argue. He never argued. He nodded, thanked the coordinator for their time, and drove home with Emma asleep in the passenger seat, her cleat still on, and said nothing about it to her the next morning beyond a quiet explanation that Coach Danny would be running practice for a while. He told himself it didn't matter, that he'd only signed up because the team needed someone, that his job had never been about being seen. But something in him, something that had been quietly rebuilding itself over 3 weeks of watching a shy, hungry kid named Ava Brooks turn into a ball player right in front of him, went dark and small again, folded itself back into the shape it had held for years before that gymnasium meeting, where his hand had gone up almost against his own will. What none of the parents in that room knew, what even Ryan himself hadn't fully put together yet, was that Abigail Brooks had sat in the back row of that evaluation meeting in complete silence, watching a man she now knew for certain was Ryan Mitchell get quietly pushed out over a complaint she believed, with a certainty that made her sick to her stomach, was rooted less in genuine concern for the children, and more in her husband's wounded pride at being told no by a man in work boots. She had not spoken up. She told herself later it was because she didn't yet trust her own memory of who Ryan used to be, that 22 years was a long time and people changed, that it wasn't her place. But the truth, the one she would only admit to herself much later, staring at her ceiling at 2 a.m, was that speaking up would have meant explaining how she knew him, and she was not yet ready to reopen a door she had spent over 2 decades believing was sealed for good. If you have ever felt unseen at a moment when you'd earned better, dismissed by someone with less on the line than you, we would genuinely love to hear about it in the comments, because there is nothing quite like watching your own quiet effort get erased by someone else's loud complaint, and so many of you know exactly what that feels like. Ryan kept showing up to Emma's practices anyway, standing at the fence instead of on the field now, clapping just as hard, saying nothing, noticing everything, the same way he always had. 6 weeks would pass, 6 long, ordinary, aching weeks in which nobody on that field had any idea that a woman standing 30 feet away at the same fence line was quietly gathering the courage to walk over and finally say his name out loud. The assistant coach who replaced Ryan, a well-meaning but overextended father named Danny Ostrander, was not a bad man, but he was coaching 3 of his own kids' teams across 2 sports that summer, and had neither the time nor the eye to notice the small things Ryan had noticed automatically. Under his watch, the Hawks' record slid. Ava, without anyone quietly reminding her father to let her play her own game, started pressing at the plate again, chasing pitches, shrinking back into the tense, overcorrected kid Ryan had first pulled out of her shell in June. Abigail watched this happen from the same fence, week after week, and something in her that had been holding steady for years finally gave way. She began, without telling anyone, to look into what had actually happened to Ryan Mitchell after Millbrook. It started almost accidentally, a late-night search after Ava had gone to bed, typing his name into a search bar the way you'd pick at a scab you knew you shouldn't touch. And what she found surprised her. A decade-old regional newspaper archive mentioning a scout's interest in a Millbrook High shortstop, a short blurb about a promising local ball player whose family circumstances kept him from pursuing it further, his father's name attached, a name she remembered clearly from 100 summer evenings at that chain-link fence between their childhood backyards. She sat with that for a long time. She thought about her own life, about a marriage that had quietly hollowed itself out over years of Dale's drinking, and Dale's temper and Dale's need to be the loudest person in every room, about how she had spent so long absorbing his outbursts in silence that she'd nearly forgotten what it felt like to say a hard, true thing out loud. It was her sister visiting for a weekend and watching one of Ava's practices from the same fence, who finally pushed the question into the open. She'd noticed Abigail's face during a scrimmage, the way she watched the man on the field instead of her own daughter for entire stretches of play, and she asked bluntly, the way sisters do. Whether something was going on. Abigail told her the truth for the first time out loud. That the man who used to coach this team was Ryan Mitchell, her best friend from childhood, the boy she had never gotten to say goodbye to. The boy whose backyard fort she had cried about for a solid year after the move. The boy she had, if she was being completely honest with herself even now, never entirely stopped thinking about on certain quiet October evenings of her own. Her sister asked the obvious question, "So why haven't you said anything?" Abigail didn't have a good answer. She only knew that every time she rehearsed the words in her head, they came out sounding like a door creaking open onto a room she wasn't sure she was allowed back into. There is an old argument that never quite settles about silence, whether staying quiet is sometimes the only way to protect the people you love from a truth that might unsettle everything, or whether the person who stays silent too long ends up costing everyone more than the truth ever would have. Abigail had built her whole adult life around the first belief. She was about to find out the hard way what the second one costs. The secondary crisis arrived on a Thursday in July when Dale Brooks, 3 drinks into an evening that had started at a neighborhood barbecue, showed up to Ava's practice uninvited and, in front of the entire team and half the parents on the fence line, grabbed his daughter roughly by the arm when she made an error at short, yanking her toward the dugout and telling her, loud enough for everyone to hear, that she was embarrassing him. Ava froze, the field went silent, and it was Ryan, watching from the fence where he had no official standing to intervene at all, who moved first, closing the distance in a few long strides, and putting himself, calm and immovable, between Dale and his daughter, saying nothing threatening, saying only, in the same even voice he used on stuck bolts and broken hinges, that it was time for Dale to go home and cool off, that nobody here was going to speak to a 9-year-old like that, on his watch, official coach or not. Dale postured for a moment, red-faced, and then, with several other parents now standing and watching, backed down and left. Abigail found Ryan afterward, near the equipment shed, both of them still shaking slightly with adrenaline, and, this time she didn't hold back. She told him she needed to talk to him, that there was something he deserved to know, and that she was sorry, more sorry than she could easily explain, for not saying it weeks ago when it might have spared him the evaluation meeting entirely, because she was fairly certain now, having quietly asked around, that the complaint against him had been filed the same week Dale had learned Ryan once turned down a scout's interest to stay and support his own struggling father, a detail that had needled Dale's pride in some ugly, unspoken way he'd never have admitted to. Ryan didn't understand yet what any of it had to do with her specifically. He only knew, watching her face in the fading evening light, that the ache of familiarity he'd felt at that first practice was about to have a name attached to it. Before she could say anything more, her phone buzzed with a call from Ava's school, a separate small emergency, a stomach bug that needed picking up, and the conversation was swallowed whole by the ordinary chaos of single parenthood. The two of them left standing there, with a truth half-spoken between them, and no time left that evening to finish it. Abigail apologized again, promised they would talk soon, properly, and hurried off toward her car. Ryan stood alone by the equipment shed for a long moment afterward, the bats and helmets rattling faintly in the bag at his feet, replaying the sound of her voice, certain now that he knew this woman from somewhere far older and far deeper than 3 weeks of Tuesday practices, and utterly unable to place exactly where. 1 month later, on an ordinary Thursday afternoon neither of them would ever describe as ordinary again, Abigail Brooks would finally finish the sentence she'd started outside that equipment shed, and everything both of their daughters thought they understood about their families would change. The month that followed was the best stretch of softball the Lakeview Hawks had played all season, though not because anything official changed. Danny Ostrander, quietly overwhelmed and grateful for the help, asked Ryan if he'd come back and run drills unofficially, off the record, just showing up early to work with the girls on fundamentals before the official practice began, a workaround that kept the league coordinator's concerns technically unviolated, while putting Ryan back on the field where he belonged. He said yes without hesitation. Emma cried a little when she found out, and tried to pretend she hadn't. It was during these early, unofficial sessions that Ryan's actual expertise became impossible to ignore. He didn't just run drills. He rebuilt swings from the ground up, correcting a hitch in one girl's load that had been costing her power for 2 years, teaching Ava to read a pitcher's glove position for a tell that shaved a full half-second off her reaction time at the plate. A half-second that, at 9 years old, is the difference between a routine groundout and a line drive up the middle. He taught them the exact mechanics of a crow hop on a long throw from the outfield, the precise footwork of a double-play pivot, details so specific and so clearly hard-won from real experience that even the skeptical Travel League parents from the Riverside Comets game started quietly asking each other where this guy had actually learned the game, because rec league dads did not, as a rule, know the difference between a 4-seam grip and a 2-seam grip at a molecular level, let alone teach it patiently to a 9-year-old with a stutter. Word reached the league coordinator eventually, the way word always does, and this time it came from an unexpected direction. 3 parents, unprompted, submitted written statements describing what they'd witnessed of Ryan's coaching, describing Dale's behavior at the July practice in detail, describing the marked improvement in the girls' play and confidence since Ryan had quietly returned. The coordinator, reviewing the original complaint again with fresh eyes, discovered that Dale Brooks had never actually specified any incident of favoritism toward Emma beyond the batting order, which multiple parents now confirmed had been set entirely on merit. The complaint, under any real scrutiny, had almost nothing underneath it. But it was Abigail who delivered the final piece, and she did it not at a meeting or in an email, but in person, at Ryan's own front door on a warm evening in early August, Ava waiting in the car because her mother had told her this was a grown-up conversation that needed to happen alone first. Standing on his porch, 22 years and a lifetime of separate griefs behind her, Abigail finally said the whole of it. She told him she was the girl from the fence in Millbrook, that she'd recognized him instantly at that very first practice, that she had spent every week since trying to work up the nerve to say so, terrified of what it would mean to reopen something she'd carried quietly for over 2 decades. She told him about the move, the transfer her father hadn't been able to refuse, the letters she'd written to an old address that no longer had a Mitchell family living there because his own family had moved twice by then. She told him she'd never fully explained to anyone, not even Dale, how much that unfinished goodbye had shaped her, how she'd spent years since telling herself the fort and the bird whistles and the promise to know each other forever were just childhood things easy to outgrow, until she watched a quiet, steady man coach her daughter with the same patient attention she remembered from a boy who used to notice when her mother was having a hard week before anyone else did. And then she told him the part she'd been most afraid to say, that she believed, and had believed since the barbecue in July, that it was time to leave Dale, that the marriage had been quietly ending for years, under the weight of things she was only now finding the words for, and that watching Ryan stand between her daughter and her husband's temper without hesitation had been the moment she finally admitted to herself she could not keep protecting a version of family that was hurting Ava more than it was helping her. Ryan stood on his own porch and said very little, the way he always said very little at the moments that mattered most. But something in his stillness broke open the way it had that first day on the field, watching Ava field a routine grounder like she'd been born knowing how. He remembered her now, completely, all at once, the bird whistles and the fort, and a summer that had ended without any warning at all, and 22 years compressed themselves into a single breath, standing on a welcome mat that badly needed replacing. He did not ask her to stay married for her daughter's sake, and he did not ask her to leave for his. He only told her quietly that he was glad she'd finally said it, and that whatever came next, he wasn't going anywhere, not from the team, not from this conversation, not from whatever this turned out to be. It was not a grand declaration. It was, in its own way, exactly the kind of restraint that had defined him his entire life. The same restraint that had let a scout's phone call go unanswered years ago, the same restraint that had let a wrongful complaint go unchallenged rather than dragging a 9-year-old's team into an ugly fight. But it was enough, in that moment, to make Abigail Brooks cry on a stranger's porch that wasn't really a stranger's porch at all. 2 weeks later, the league coordinator formally reinstated Ryan as head coach, citing new information and a full review of the original complaint. And Dale Brooks, Confronted with both the coordinator's findings and his wife's decision to move forward with a separation, did not contest either, though he stopped attending games altogether after that, which every single person on that field, including his own daughter, quietly understood as the better outcome for everyone. The Hawks made the playoffs 3 weeks later, on the strength of a lineup that had finally been allowed to play loose and confident under a coach who noticed everything and demanded nothing but effort. The final piece of this story, the one that would bring Ryan and Abigail back to that same fence line where a trophy now sat forgotten in the grass, was still 6 weeks away, and neither of them could have predicted, on that August porch, exactly how much would still need saying before it was over. The championship game against the Riverside Comets went the full 7 innings, tied until the bottom of the last, when Ava Brooks stepped into the batter's box with 2 outs, and Emma Mitchell standing on second base, having reached on a double she'd hit off a changeup. Ryan had spent 3 separate practices teaching her to recognize by the pitcher's grip. Ryan gave no signal from the third base coach's box beyond a small, steady nod, the same nod he'd been giving Ava all season, the one that said simply, "You know how to do this." She fouled off 2 pitches, took a ball outside, and then turned on a fastball letter high and drove it into the gap in left center, deep enough to score Emma standing up, deep enough that the entire Hawks bench emptied onto the field in the pile that Ryan had been standing outside of, clapping, when Abigail walked up to the fence and finally asked him whether he remembered her. What happened after that question, in the version of events the whole team eventually pieced together, was quiet by comparison to the chaos of the celebration around them. Ryan told her plainly that he did remember her, that he had for weeks now, and that he was grateful, more grateful than he knew how to say cleanly, that she had finally found the nerve to ask. There was no grand speech in front of the crowd. The two of them simply stood at that fence for a long moment while their daughters, oblivious in the joyful way only children can be, screamed and hugged their teammates 20 feet away. The league, in the weeks that followed, offered Ryan a modest stipend and the title of head coach going into the fall travel season, the first real recognition the district had ever formally given him for 2 decades of quietly noticing things nobody else bothered to notice, on ball fields and in boiler rooms alike. He turned down the money. He asked instead for something else. A standing agreement that the district would never again let an unsubstantiated complaint sideline a volunteer coach without a full and fair hearing first? A small procedural change that would likely never make headlines, but would, he pointed out, have spared him 6 lonely weeks at a fence line and might spare some other quiet parent the same thing someday. The coordinator, somewhat stunned that a man who'd been wronged wasn't asking for so much as an apology on the record, agreed on the spot. The quiet coda came 2 months later, on an ordinary Saturday morning in October, the same month that had once swallowed a childhood friendship without warning. Ryan and Abigail sat on the same low chain-link fence, no longer separating 2 backyards but running along the edge of the same softball field, watching Emma and Ava run an informal fall clinic drill together. Inseparable now in the easy, uncomplicated way that only 2 9- and 10-year-olds who have decided to be best friends can manage. Abigail reached over at one point and fixed a loose thread on the cuff of Ryan's jacket, an unthinking, familiar gesture that neither of them commented on, and for a moment the whole field went quiet around them, just the 2 of them and the low afternoon light and 22 years finally, fully closed. There is a particular kind of worth that never shows up on a scoreboard or a resume, the quiet kind, built out of showing up on time, noticing what other people miss, and never once needing anyone to see it in order to keep doing it anyway. If you have ever been the person standing at the edge of a field, doing the work without the title, without the credit, without anyone clapping for you specifically, this story was for you. Ava's borrowed cleats, too big at the start of the season, fit her perfectly by the end of it, and there is something in that small, unremarkable detail worth sitting with. The things that don't quite fit at first sometimes just need a little steady time and the right person paying attention. If you believe that quiet, overlooked people deserve to be seen eventually, we would love for you to stay part of this story with us and subscribe, not because the algorithm needs it, but because there is always another overlooked hero's story waiting to be told, and we would be glad to have you here for the next one. and for the final truth still waiting at the very end.